everyone. Welcome back to the next episode of Stream Time Sports. My name is Chris Stone, the community lead, joined as always by our CEO, Nick Meacham, and special guest, our technology editor, Steve McCaskill. It was just this time last week, the trio was all together in the home of football, the London Stadium, the home of the West Ham United Hammers. What a great time that was for the three of us to all be back together. It's been a while since the three of us have all been in person in one place.
You could have said like the home of the London 2012 Olympics, the home of something else, but the home of football that's a stretch.
I'd say it's the home of being kettled into a shopping centre after attending a sporting event is probably how I'd go with it. But yeah.
But also, it's serious. All seriousness, the weather was pretty London-like. I'm not used to all this just overcast, murky clouds all the time. But just I love the whole environment around the stadium, in between the shopping centre, perhaps. It is quite a surreal place to be in London. I do really love going out there.
Chris and I were talking for the event. I'm actually a fan of the stadium. I did go to the 2012 Olympics and loved it. I've been to baseball. I've been to rugby there. I've been to see West Ham. I've been to see West Ham win, Chris, in a European game. That was very exciting.
Was the moon blue?
Can't confirm the conditions, but yes, it was a wonderful venue. In all honesty, I just prefer a more traditional route to the stadium.
I think the only time I've been to there for something live was actually an AC/DC concert. So that was quite fun. A bit of a different vibe to an AI conference, I have to say.
Nick, be more Australian.
I'm wondering if I wore my flip flops, or sorry, thongs, I should say, if I'm going in full Australian. And that's probably, I need to cut that out. Probably that's going to get me in a lot of trouble. Maybe the censors.
Well, speaking to your other roots, your Swedish roots, Nick, my favorite part about the West Ham Stadium is when you leave the game and the ABBA voyage is ending at the same time, and you have this merging of drunken West Hams, usually not happy about the result, clashing with these middle-aged women leaving the ABBA voyage, and it's just a very interesting hodgepodge collision of different personality types.
You get a clash of singing Dancing Queen and whatever the Hammers song is.
Nothing that can be repeated on this podcast.
Yeah, that is an interesting mix. It definitely, you can really feel that. I was stayed nearby on the Saturday and the Sunday, and you definitely can feel there was actually a mix, I think, because the Hammers played during the day, and then you could feel the blending of this ABBA-like group of people distilled across the Westfield shopping centre, ready for their experience. So it was quite an interesting mix.
So we will deep dive into Nick on a later episode, but just because we are talking about the Sports Pro AI conference, for you, did you have any just sort of top line thoughts? And I'll come to you, Steve, with a similar question. Like I said, we will deep dive into specific topics and things like that, but just overall 2 days on the ground, Nick, was there anything in particular that stood out to you?
I'm going to use all my good stuff for when we actually do a bit of a review. I would say, look, it was just interesting to hear the different journeys people are on. Some people have been in the AI space for so long, and talking AI is nothing new to them. They've been in the space for a decade. And then you go to the other extreme, and there's sports. I remember talking to loads of sports organizations, teams and leagues, and they're like, we're just trying to work it all out. We have no idea really what we should and shouldn't be doing. And then the people in the middle who have just started that journey, who are now also, almost everyone who is now using AI is accelerating their use of it in more and more ways. So it's just interesting to see how disparate the industry is, I guess, around AI already, which means that we've got a really good job to do to make sure that the people who are new to the space are coming along for the ride quickly, and we're able to make sure that everyone's sort of maximizing the value of AI to everything from operational efficiency to even business performance, because it seems like we're only at the starting point for a lot of teams and leagues in this industry.
And what about you, Steve? Did anything similar to that, completely different from that? What was, if you had to say, was one key takeaway?
No, to be fair, broadly similar, and it's something I said on our sister podcast, the Sports Pro podcast, that there was just a lot of level-headedness, and that was really refreshing. As someone who has to hear a lot of these hot takes on AI a lot, it was actually quite nice to hear people genuinely wanted to learn. People were discussing, they weren't talking at people about, you're not doing AI, you're going to fall behind. It was just people really wanting to find out how to use it in practical terms. They know AI is going to be an interesting technology. They know it's going to change the way they do things. They also understand that it's not like if you don't do AIO tomorrow, you've lost. That's the way. So I think it was nice to have some sensible discussions. I learned quite a few things. As I said in the pod, I also saw a couple of things that really blew me away, which doesn't happen too often in the job. So, yeah, it was a fascinating couple of days.
Well, like I said, we will talk about that on a later pod, Nick and I. And then, as Steve mentioned, if you want to get his thoughts specifically, check out the Sports Pro podcast. But today, we're going to talk about the Champions League. It's an interesting time. We're back to European football this week, although the new format kicked off the week just before. But it is a whole new format, more teams involved. Players would argue it's just a money grab, and it's not actually on the benefit of football. But, I enjoy having a bit more football nonetheless. But today, we're going to talk through the Champions League. It's a bit interesting compared to, I suppose, some of the other leagues we talk about that tend to be largely domestic. The NFLs, the Premier Leagues of the world, but then we also talk about, the Olympics or the World Cup. This is certainly different to those, and the fact it runs every year. It's, international in the sense across Europe, but an interesting property nonetheless. So, Steve, you have, self-proclaimed to have read quite a few books about the Champions League. So we are going to lean on you a little bit. And, I guess maybe the first question is just give us a little bit of the background on the origins of it. Because I'll be honest with you, I am a relatively new football fan. For me, Champions League has just always been a part of my watch experience. I've never known football in my dozen years of probably consistently watching to not know of Champions League. But I imagine that's surely not the case. So maybe just a little bit of background on the Champions League itself.
Yeah, although there's not really a good book on the Champions League, actually. The more I think about it, it's all sort of an amalgamation of everything. I read too much about sport. We know this all as it is, and I have a history degree, so it kind of it goes hand in hand. But yeah, I think so. The Champions League, European Champions Cup, to give it its original title, it starts in it's 1955, and it's a real post-war product in that it's another example of, I'm going to say, European integration. And you could argue that it was actually a really good example because it included teams from the Soviet Union and from Eastern Europe and what have you. So it's arguably, even a stronger form of integration than other institutions at the time. And television wasn't the main reason. Funny enough, it was a factor, but it wasn't the main reason why the competition was created. There was TV in Europe in the 1930s, but very few people had sets. There was TV coverage of the 1936 Olympics, but they were in viewing houses, and most TV switched off during the war in Europe anyway. And then more people do get TV sets in the 40s and 50s because we have the coronation in the UK. We also have the FA Cup finals are being broadcast, but it's still not. It was nowhere near what we get today. And there were very few, I guess, pan-European competitions, which is for us seems crazy now, and it's even behind South America on that front. South America, when air travel happens, things like the Copa Libertadores and the Copa America become a possibility. We have the World Cup, but it doesn't really become a proper World Cup until 1950 anyway. And there's no European Championship in 1960, so it's still quite a novel thing. There's a couple of tournaments. There's a couple called the Mitropa Cup, which is for Central Europe, but teams from Europe are still doing tours, and they're going to South America, they're going to Europe, and post-war, there's a big boost in attendances, but it begins to fall away slightly in the early 1950s. And then we have this amazing new technology called floodlighting coming out. Well, it's not really a new technology because it's new to England specifically. And in South America, again, it's been used for years because you can't play in the middle of the day, so you need to play in the evening. It's just too hot. Some countries are doing floodlight matches with cars, car headlights and things like that. So England discovers floodlights, and to inaugurate their floodlights, rather, they start staging these glamour friendlies against some of the biggest clubs in the world at the time. So Arsenal they play some at Highbury, but the biggest team was Wolves. Wolves were a really good team in the 1950s, and of course, it's well before my time, but I've heard, I've read about this. Even one of my old teachers at school. I did a project school, said, you've really underplayed how good Wolves were in the 1950s. And they started playing Spartak Moscow, Honved from Hungary, which is the most famous match. And after these matches, they declare themselves to be champions of the world, or rather the media does. And like most international football competitions, a Frenchman sees this and thinks, "Oh no, this isn't on. We should have a real European Championship." And eventually, it does get underway. UEFA's not, super interested in it, but eventually does take ownership of it, and so we start to see the first European Championship, and it's a combination of television, it's a combination of floodlights, it's a combination of European integration, and bearing in mind England, for example, just wasn't interested in TV. It resisted floodlights. This is quite a novel, really exciting thing to have all these famous players playing in England. It's on TV. Something like, I think it's 1965 European Cup semi-finals. Real Madrid is watched by 6.5 million people in England, which is astronomical for the time. That's a really big number when you consider there's about less than 10,000 sets before the war. So there is some television coverage. I think it's bigger elsewhere than it is in England. Eventually, it's only really the final that's shown in England. So BBC and ITV would alternate who shows the European Cup final, who shows the Cup Winners' Cup final. Chris, I'm not going to explain what the Cup Winners' Cup is. You'll have to look it up. But West Ham won it in 1965, so there is that. But
we saw the sign for it within the stadium. I believe it was their last major trophy before the one they won 2 years ago, more recently than Man United.
That's not true. We won the FA Cup, and it's a television event, but it's not what we recognise. And there's also more enthusiasm for it in some other countries. So Spain, obviously, the advent of television and the rise of Real Madrid coincides with Franco in Spain, and he really likes Real Madrid on TV because it makes his Spain look good. So yeah, it kind of just doesn't really change from the 50s through to the early 1990s. It's kind of a TV event. It's kind of not. Football was a really bad business at that point anyway. So that's kind of how it got off the ground.
Well, that's a little jump there. You see, there's all the details, Stephen. You go, from 1950s to 1990s, it didn't really change much. That's but obviously one of the reasons that it was probably not as popular was obviously, maybe obviously is not the right word here, but the ability to broadcast seamlessly and easily at a pan-European or international level back then wasn't nearly as easy as it is today with technology, right?
Yeah, so you get coverage of the 1954 World Cup in Switzerland is the first to have live coverage in more than one country. That's with the Eurovision network. So most people think of it as a song contest, but it was actually a network. Basically, it's a series of relays, effectively. And have it again for the World Cup in Sweden. We don't have it for the 1962 World Cup in Chile because that's tape delayed, and then there's a bit more of concerted effort in '66 in England. So yeah, there's not really the same infrastructure in place. There's also not the same distribution channels. So most countries, still have just analog terrestrial television, and sport is only a fraction of what is shown. You don't really get regular live games on TV into the 1980s, domestically anyway. France with Canal Plus, for example. So it just, there isn't the same appetite there is now. There's not the same capacity, and it's not like the US where there's more overt, I guess, commercial impetus to make it happen.
Well, I always just thought that one of the further to your point about the appetite, back in those days, I can imagine it would have been difficult to determine what matches are interesting and not interesting to, for example, a domestic audience. So naturally, and the scheduling component of that, like now the deal's done with the internationalized global world we live in today, you have access to media and insight, and there's followings of all these players in other markets. But I imagine, not being from Europe, you would have to be a really passionate football fan to follow what's happening in Serie A, for example, to have any sort of interest if you're if you're living in the UK. And so if the match wasn't UK and so Serie A or La Liga, etc., if your team wasn't playing, you probably didn't have as much of an interest in what was going to be shown on TV, and therefore broadcasters would not have been able to pick up a lot of the matches that were being broadcast in that iteration, versus now where I think everyone's got much more of a global interest, right?
Yeah, I think that it is an interesting point. I would think it's similar in America, where I would imagine Champions League has become more popular as Peacock's had the Premier League and ESPN has taken over things like La Liga and Bundesliga. I would imagine there's a pretty similar correlation there, because to your point, Nick, it probably was more difficult to keep up with teams that were outside of your local area. I mean, maybe Steve's going to come in and correct us, but logically that makes sense.
Yeah, but also because there was such a finite amount of time available for broadcasting back then, and that's obviously the crux here, is that there was only a limited amount of channels available, limited amount of linear. That not every game was going to be broadcast, so getting that planning and timing right would have been really complicated, I'd imagine.
Yeah, there's just there wasn't the internet. There'd be maybe some newspaper articles from time to time. Your real window into the world of football at the time was the World Cup, and that was the reason the World Cup was this this unbelievable, I guess, moment. Every 4 years, you see players that you may have heard of. If you subscribe to a football magazine or something, you might hear about them. You probably had very few chances to see Pele play ever. You'd see it on the World Cup, and never mind Europe. In England, you only had the FA Cup final. Never mind watching other teams. You had the FA Cup final, European Cup final. That was kind of it, really. You'd have to really go out of your way to find out what was happening, as you say, in other leags. So there was that allure, and I think in the early years of the European Cup, people did know who Eusebio were because of the '66 World Cup. They knew who Di Stefano was. They knew French Puskas. So it kind of cements the appeal of the European Cup final. But as you say, there's nowhere near the same level of coverage. These are names rather than faces to a lot of people.
So you talked about it, for a long period of time, because of the reasons you just mentioned, it wasn't necessarily this large commercial entity from a broadcast perspective. But I'm assuming, as you alluded to, as we start to get into the 80s and 90s, that begins to change. And you referenced throughout that, you're talking about BBC, ITV, people we know to be massive free-to-air providers, but we know today that that's simply not the case. So maybe talk a little bit sort of how we make that transition from the competition you were describing to now all of a sudden this more globally represented, financially profitable sports property that it is today.
Yeah, it was. I guess I've got two words really. It's Silvio Berlusconi,
Wow.
Yeah,
this could go already in any sort of direction now, Steve. I'm really curious what the next words are going to be.
It was interactive podcasts. You pick your story. Say what you like about Berlusconi, and there's many things you can say. I think few people really appreciated that relationship between commercialization and football as much as Berlusconi did at the time. He created a media empire in Italy by trying, basically taking what was effectively a local network and taking it to 11, selling satellite dishes, trying to sell, use sport as a way to get his products into the homes of many people as possible. Obviously, he had, AC Milan, and even his political party was called Forza Italia. It's that's that's a football chart. So he knew the ability of, he knew the power of football basically, and the famous story, I think it's 1988 when Real Madrid, obviously one of the biggest names in European football, were drawn to play Napoli, who had won their first Serie A title with Diego Maradona, and they were drawn in the first round. And the logic was, how could this happen? How can two of the biggest draws in European football play in the first round, and all the broadcasters lose one of the biggest teams at that stage? They only get to broadcast them twice, which is a home and away leg. And I think Berlusconi's words were he described the European Champions Cup, which, as I said, hadn't really changed, as a historical anachronism. And he started working with Real Madrid to work on a new format, and very similar to the European Super League, which I think we'll talk about a bit shortly. He worked on not necessarily a breakaway competition, but he even called it the working title of the thing was even European Television League. He was working with them. They're working with Saatchi and Saatchi on the concept of it, and eventually UEFA became aware of it and realized they had to work with this movement rather than against it, and that set the foundations for what became the Champions League and this international media behemoth that we know today.
So, Steve, the people that came up with it, the team marketing business, do you know much about how that actually really came together? Like how they actually got to a point where they could launch a commercial entity to manage all of these commercial rights? Because it's such a unique situation that's played out with them, this third party organization popping up to take on these commercial rights. But now you see more and more people have tried that since. I mean, countless examples of that. But do you know how it got to come to fruition, really?
Well, I don't know how it got to that stage, but UEFA very much realised they needed to do something, and it was better to work with it than against it. And team marketing responsible for the branding, which was hugely successful. They created the whole, I don't know what they call it, but I guess it's the Starball concept. I think that is actually what they call it, and they wanted to create this. They wanted to make it different to anything else in football. And we all know the anthem. I was hoping Chris was going to start his pod by singing it to us.
No one needs to hear me sing.
Maybe we'll add that in the end, just as a cold open. So yeah, they get the sport team marketing, who still work with Uefa today, I believe. They also are in Switzerland, and they realize they've got to have this core branding across. It's got to be across Europe. The concept of the anthem, which now seems, we see it in a lot of sports. That's quite a big thing. And they also work on the commercial strategy of the event, and they create almost like a mini top program. So the Olympic top program, where there's a certain number of partners, rather title partner or what have you, and they work that, and it's a really strong commercial proposition. It's really good revenue. They do some really novel things like bundle in media with the sponsorship. So if you watch the Champions League, it's always, this program is brought to you by Heineken, or occasionally in previous years Gazprom. But that's the sort of
that's changed a little bit later. Yeah,
that's the sort of thing it did. So it's all real. It's all things that were really, we all take for granted now, but I think they were really novel at the time, and they've been replicated by loads of other properties. I think they were very influenced by the US and what they did. But now you look at, even the Premier League has a similar thing. They have effectively a top program. They don't. It's not the Barclays Premier League. They have people like Guinness, or in different categories. And I think it's just, with hindsight, given what we knew about the Champions League, the Champions Cup, and what became the Champions League in a short space of time, it's actually quite revolutionary how that all happens so quickly.
One thing I was just going to ask Steve, as it came to be bigger and bigger, obviously, I would say football in general has got bigger and bigger. I appreciate and recognize that the Premier League isn't something that's always existed. It's actually, my understanding, Steve, is it younger than the Champions League?
It's the same season.
Is it? Oh, interesting. But just thinking sort of the growth of all those leagues, but they also collaborate together. I'd just be interested in your opinion, sort of, the Premier League's obviously trying to grow its own, commercial profile, but at the same time, the top 4 teams from the Premier League make the Champions League. Same thing with La Liga, the Bundesliga, just how they compete, and then how they kind of complement each other. Just an opinion on your piece in terms of how they position. I just find it very interesting, sort of how those two kind of coexist.
I think they all see it as a necessary relationship now. I mean, you think about the reason why the Premier League is such an interesting competition is race for the top 4, and it also elevates the international profile of the clubs as well. I mean, in the early days, the like any innovation, the domestic leagues weren't interested in the European football. Chelsea won the old Division 1 title and were told they couldn't enter the European Cup the following season because it would interfere with their domestic schedule. Man United won the league the following year and said, we're going to the European Cup. So I think there is a understanding between the two. I think the current arrangement, and again with the expanded format, I think is perhaps something the leagues wouldn't necessarily want, but they also understand that the alternative could be a Super League, which we saw almost try to get off the ground 3 years ago. So I think in let's say the big 5 leagues, you look at when you look at the size of the TV rights, right? Domestic leagues are still bigger than the Champions League, and they because it's greater inventory, it means more to a lot of fans. It's more clubs. So there is that. I think unless that starts to be threatened, then it's still going to be the status quo is going to be fine. I mean, you look in England, Sky don't even go for the Champions League anymore. They don't feel like they don't need it because they've got the Premier League, and that's so important.
I mean, back then, Chris, there wasn't that competitive tension at all for people's time and attention. That they weren't really fighting it out for each other. It was just more. It was just a new opportunity that was presented to itself. Whereas now, yeah, like to Steve's point, the reason Sky doesn't need to really invest in it is because they think they have a critical mass of football rights that engages and interests the majority of the UK sports and football market, and adding the Champions League to that isn't going to really move the needle for them. That wasn't an issue because of the way also the sports was broadcast many years ago. That dynamic between like pay TV and linear and free to air just didn't exist to that scale. So we are really in a completely different ball game now. And back then, it would have been just. I just do wonder though, Steve. I guess in terms of back to the launch of it all, just how lofty were the goals that they had at the time? Like, was it just successful beyond their wildest dreams, or were they a bit Infantino-esque, I'm going to say, and starting to present themselves like, we're going to get billions of dollars for these rights before they even launch the product? Do you have any sense of what that was like back then?
This was something I was trying to find out, and if we use Infantino's, I assume we're talking about his dreams of the Club World Cup becoming,
yes,
particularly
relevant now at this moment with what he's been saying around that, and also the Women's World Cup when he was calling everyone into meetings saying they should be paying more media rights values and not really understanding how supply and demand works.
I think the crucial difference was that it was the market demanding these changes for the Champions League. They wanted more games. They wanted these bigger matchups between the bigger European giants. So I think when you've got people wanting your rights, it's a bit of an easier thing to do. I was trying to find out what the initial expectations were, because again, it's not to age myself. I was very young when the Champions League first started, so for me, it's just always been there. And it's very easy to take for granted now that it's because it's more than 30 years old. I don't know if they ever envisaged what it's turned into, and I also think there's been a lot of unforeseen circumstances of what's happened, particularly with things like less competitive national leagues. So you look at for many years, I think they won 10 leagues in a row. So in Norway, Rosenborg were always in the Champions League. They always got that TV money, always got that prize money, and they just they just walked the Norwegian league every year. I don't think it's not the case. It's not the case anymore because there's different economic impacts have happened. So I don't think they ever envisaged it would become like this. There's always been talk of Super League. Like, that's the other thing. When that news happened, it was like, well, this had happened in the late 90s. It always seemed to be this permanent spectre over the Premier League and the Champions League, that it was going to become an even bigger thing. So I don't know if they ever thought the Champions League would effectively become that Super League. And again, it was something I was trying to find some contemporary accounts of what they thought, or what people genuinely thought beyond the marketing bluster. But I think they knew that they were on to create something bigger, and there was demand for it, and it was definitely not trying to create a competition out of thin air, with the promise of prize money that has to be paid for somehow.
I would have loved to have been around those negotiations back then, because I don't know, it just feels like we're so down the line with the way that how commercial the industry is now, that the dynamic of, well, I guess similar to what they've gone through with the European Super League, would have been really interesting to be in the room of those conversations between UEFA and all the key stakeholders of requisite leagues to put that all together. So I'm still impressed that they were able to achieve it.
Speaking about the broadcast, Steve, just bring it more to the modern days now. Like I said, you talked a bit about BBC and ITV being prominent, but now we're looking at almost an exclusively paid TV model. Just maybe perhaps outlining a little bit sort of where the Champions League is at today in terms of their actual broadcast strategy.
Yeah, so in the early days, it was quite. I mean, there were exceptions, but it was a lot of free-to-air TV. In the UK, we had ITV for the first decade or so, and interestingly, ITV tried to take it to pay TV, but failed. In the it was what was on digital, and then it became ITV digital, and part of the issue was that it was exclusive to the digital terrestrial television, so it didn't really take off. And I think that was that was just a considered thing to do. Pay TV was a thing, but it wasn't what it is now. Sky and Canal Plus were probably the earliest, real the success stories on that front. And if you are creating a competition whereby the commercial arrangements are a big thing of it. Media is bundled into your package. You want as wide an audience as possible, which is free to air TV if you're Mastercard or Ford or one of those early partners. But then pay TV does become mainstream, and when you've got this quite large inventory of games, you are quite an attractive proposition. And in the early 2000s, it really begins to switch towards an element of free to air and pay TV, and the selling point being you can watch any game you want. Which again, we always I've said this a few times in this pod, that things we take for granted now. It was just this was a clear way of getting more money while also telling you you're getting more for that, which isn't always the case now. You've got used to it. See the Olympics, and then as pay TV's become bigger and consumption habits have changed, the amount on free to air TV has got slowly and slowly less, to the point we haven't had any free to air games in the UK for a decade, and I'm not including BT Sports Showcase, which was a thing when they first won the rights. So it's an entirely pay TV proposition in a lot of countries, mainly in the bigger markets. So, for example, in Switzerland and Ireland, there's still one free game a week, which is intriguing, and but not in the UK or other countries. So it clearly feels now that the competition is mature enough to be behind a paywall entirely. It feels like that's what the audience is. The audience is used to paying for content. In many cases, the audience is used to paying for more than one subscription. Again, if you want to watch the Premier League and the Champions League in the UK, you have to have at least 2 subs, or 3 now because of Amazon dipping its toes in both markets actually. So the shift now for that free to air or getting that exposure has kind of moved to digital platforms. So social media, YouTube, working with the broadcasters. And then in the UK, for the first time this year in many years, we've got a free to air highlights program, the BBC, which is very interesting, not least because the BBC can't show adverts. So no one's getting the exposure from that, just because of the actual restrictions they've got on it. So, and that's increased revenue significantly. Haven't got the figures to hand continent wide, but it's just gone up and up. It's become a bigger and bigger thing, and it's in most countries it's probably the second biggest property, unless you've got a few exceptions. I'm trying to think of one, off the top of my head. Maybe a small, in a different country like hockey might be bigger, or there's the basketball league, but it's certainly basically domestic football league, and then maybe the Champions League. So yeah, it's just become bigger and bigger. It doesn't really need free to air in most cases unless it's absolutely mandated to have it.
I think the interesting bit that stood out with for me, Steve, when you were running through that is and previously when you talked about Sky not really needing it anymore, they didn't feel they needed it. Is I wonder, I haven't looked at the data on this, but how many of the major football broadcasters in major European markets have both Champions League and their local major league because of that whole, the crossover component of those audiences versus, say, another competitor saying, well, we don't have those rights. We don't have the domestic ones. We're going to go for the Champions League, which is still a great draw card, and we'll take those and it'll give us access to much of that audience we're missing out on. Do you have a sense of how prominent that is?
Yeah, that's something I wish I'd actually looked up before and had the information in front of me. But there's definitely, I'm going to say anecdotally, definitely some truth to that. And I think that's partly because of, as you say, they feel like that critical mass of content. I also think cost is a big thing now as well for a lot of these broadcasters. But if we look at France, for example, Canal Plus doesn't have any Ligue 1 anymore, but it's got Champions League. So that's a case of it where it's decided to put its money, which you never know. France perhaps is slightly unique among the big five in that respect, because it's it's of what's happened recently. But like you look, DAZN have, I think they have Champions League and Bundesliga, or at least they're trying to get Bundesliga, but that's a story for another day. So yeah, the rights definitely become fragmented, and I think in markets where there's more than one major player, they tend to be split because it's an issue of content. I was thinking it's an issue of cost. You can't have everything anymore.
Well, the cost bit, it comes down to the ROI more than cost. Is you won't get the ROI on having both of those sets of rights unless you just jack up the price and expect demand to be inelastic and stay strong. But yeah, I think it's just an interesting predicament, and it leans into, I guess, the power of high quality content, how it can move audiences. But equally, there is a threshold that now, with data and insight, more of the major platforms are willing to go, okay, we know that this is not going to help us move the needle enough. They can. It's not a feel. You don't have to speculate. You can kind of see the data to make those decisions now.
I think it becomes a question of how many more subscribers are you going to get, and can you get the ARPU, right? Like, how much more? It's almost, even it might cost you more to get from two providers, it's more palatable for them to have two subscriptions, or it's a much easier sell. It doesn't become immediately expensive. So yeah, it's just modern market economics, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I just think it comes down to, now you talked about ARPU and so forth. I think now we're even getting more specific across the industry as to how to measure the value of content. It's also much heavier on churn rate now as well, because the market has come to a point of critical mass from a maturation of subscription uptake. And there's a whole bunch of other, adoption time. You think Netflix are really focused on the amount of time people are watching on their platforms, because that can lead to a likelihood of how long they stay with the platform itself. I think it's Netflix. I think they all probably are to some extent. But anyway, no, I think it's just an interesting evolution of how specific data points can really guide strategy these days, which has possibly led to sports having some challenges in justifying rights values, as well as giving the cream of the crop more opportunity to generate more income.
Well, just a slight shift here. We've primarily focused about the Champions League and its impact on the European broadcast industry, but we do know that football, soccer is growing in popularity across America as well. I referenced earlier about the Premier League being a part of Peacock, and then the ESPN has both the Bundesliga and La Liga. But then looking at the Champions League has been picked up by CBS. CBS is doing some interesting things from a streaming perspective. But maybe, Steve, just talk a little bit about how the Champions League has perhaps been able to grab onto that wave of momentum of the sport growing over in the US as well, in terms of what it's doing from a media perspective.
Yeah, so CBS has kind of stumbled upon the Champions League by accident, and they've because they received the rights. The rights for Girls Bundesliga League, for many years they were held by Fox, and then they moved on to, I think it was Turner.
Yeah,
and
we were down at the studios at the time, Steve.
Yeah, before my Sports Pro time. But Turner relinquished the rights. CBS got their hands on them, and they've turned it into this weird entertainment hybrid where they've assembled a studio show, which is Kate Abdo, Jamie Carragher, Mika Richards, and Thierry Henry. The latter three are quite well known on British screens, and they've turned it into almost like the studio show is almost part of the entertainment. In the UK we get the clips over there. We don't get the live coverage. My uncle, who is, as Chris knows, lives in Ohio, he's not a big fan of it, but he is British and he is a Liverpool fan, so there is that. But for the most part, it's almost like college game day. Like, it's taken the elements of that and turned it into this thing that people will stay for the football, but they also watch the pre-game show at the halftime, and they've had really big success. They've used it as a cornerstone. It's one of the flagship sports program things on Paramount Plus. It's also heavily promoted through the Galazzo network, which is CBS's Fast channel, and some games have appeared on the main CBS networks as well. So I don't think, obviously, if you're a football fan, you knew what the Champions League was. If you're a casual sports fan, you'd know who Real Madrid, Barcelona, Bayern Munich, Manchester United are in the US. But I don't know if the Champions League was that big a deal, because it wasn't marketed as well. And I think it now is. And I think it'd be very interesting when those rights come up for renewal as to what will happen to them. Because I think football's growth in the US has been a long-term journey. The growth of the Champions League feels very recent, and I think it's mainly because of what CBS have done. I think they pay something like, I think it's like $250 million or something like that a season. It's a drop in the ocean if you think about the amount that it will have to pay for the NFL. So yeah, I think what's happened over there has been really interesting. It falls part into that wider growth of football in the US, and it's definitely one of the more premium football products, maybe up there with Premier League now.
I vaguely remember from our time at the Atlanta event and hearing some very disgruntled Turner employees and basically suggesting that CBS were mad to do that deal at the scale that pipped them to the post there. But I think to your point, Steve, around particularly the pre-game show stuff and the shoulder content that they're creating, I think CBS has got a bit of a history of being really focused on the production, the experience, and the storytelling around it. And that's why they've been so successful at holding on to the NFL for so long. They do more than just focus on the live game experience. I know maybe Turner, without looking into it, perhaps didn't do as good a job with that. And it shows the power of great shoulder content, cross-marketing, social media, the role it can play in driving value of premium rights. And they probably did it at a time when the industry was just working that out, if you know what I mean. Like they've been really along the same journey and timeline. So I think it's been super interesting to see. I do wonder when you see an American broadcaster, I guess, getting the value and exposure internationally that their shoulder programming is creating, how much value that brings back to CBS and how much of it's wasted because of the value of not driving audiences to the main platform. I mean, you can generate great awareness for CBS, but that means nothing outside the US. Okay, some cross revenue from YouTube and some of their social platforms around advertising. Okay, a little bit. Maybe sponsorship of the shows, they can get extra exposure for some of their partners, where they can bring that to life commercially. But you know what I mean? It's just like, it's when you're such a locally focused proposition, how do you get the value into when you're getting such international exposure?
Maybe it could be that when the rights to come up for renewal, UEFA will value that the ability to go viral, that digital exposure. Maybe that could be if it's not much in it financially, think, well, we get this out of it, we know it's a good thing. Maybe Paramount by someone in the UK. Who knows? We'll find that out. We get their coverage. It's slightly off topic. It's interesting about CBS because I don't know how much influence they will have over this, but of course they're going to be producing Netflix's Christmas NFL games. So I'm wondering if there's that you might be on something there, Nick, or it could be just because they're free. As in available Christmas Day. Who knows?
Yeah, maybe they didn't want to partner with the NBC because NBC is doing obviously Amazon's broadcast production. So maybe that will go with the other guys who are used to doing this stuff. But
yeah. Well, the other thing I find interesting about the Champions League, just anecdotally speaking to my friends, is the Premier League works out really well during the football season because you wake up at 7 a.m., watch the first kickoff, watch the second kickoff, and then you're straight into college football. And it's the same with the Premier League. Champions League being in the middle of the week, they get those kickoffs at about 3, 4 p.m. And maybe my friends are just unique, but they all seem to find a way to always be able to watching the games and things like that. It is an interesting experience when I'm texting them back and forth because I know they should be in the office doing work, but they're always there to see a score go across in the Champions League. So I do think some of that shorter content is a must because it's not that same primetime viewing, where I do think you probably do need to do a little bit extra. You can't just rely as heavily just on the content alone. But it is interesting because, like I said, I know my friends should be working and they're clearly not.
Well, but especially in a market where it's not the primary sport of choice as well. So you have to find ways to generate cut through more than anyone. And it's pretty incredible that just a few talking heads basically can create and layer up on the live broadcast product and proposition to ensure it's maximizing the value of those rights. That's easy said than done.
Yeah. So, Steve, something I know we could do an entire podcast on, but we will just touch on because we did reference at the start of the Champions League was just the other week. And this year is new. There's an expansion to the amount of teams. They're doing a whole new tournament structure. It has included more games, and that's largely been attributed to whether or not UEFA have officially said this is a way to try to fight off the growth of the European Super League, is a way to generate more revenue to keep existing members of the tournament happy and not be swayed to other avenues for making money through broadcasts. And just maybe talk a little bit just how this change perhaps impacts things from a broadcast media perspective or any other way you want to frame it.
Yeah, I think we can see this as a response to the Super League. And I think it comes back down to the main argument why the Champions League was created. They want more matches between the bigger teams. Since the Champions League was created 30 years ago, one of the consequences has been this concentration of talent in 10, 12 clubs across Europe. It's made the group stage of the Champions League fairly predictable. Some teams don't face each other until there's not enough big clashes until the knockout rounds, which are in February. So I think it's been engineered to a couple of things actually. One is to create more of these games, to create more games full stop, and to create these clashes earlier on in the season so that it strengthens it as a broadcast product throughout the entire calendar year. So I think that's why it's been done. It also, in theory, that's the official line, should lead to more exciting matches throughout, because the top 8 qualify automatically for whatever out. I think they're calling it the knockout rounds, and then there's the 9 through to 24 go through what they're calling a playoff round. So the idea is that you're constantly fighting for your seeding. You're constantly fighting for which round you go through. So to create more jeopardy, although the cynic in me thinks it's to make sure that the bigger clubs don't go out too early by giving them more games against more varied group of teams. So there's that, and that's been replicated across the secondary competitions, so the Europa League and the Conference League. Again, that's a lot more games. That's a lot of inventory to sell, usually to the same broadcaster, but there have been a few instances of the Champions League rights being spun off from the rest. So again, that's multiple packages for a streamer to get their hands on. I think it's in the Nordics we've seen examples of that, to try different things. So yeah, I think politically it's an attempt to fend off the ESL. From a practical standpoint, I think it's just more games for broadcast partners, more attractive games for them, and I think it strengthens it as a proposition. I think it does make the secondary competitions a bit weaker by taking 4 more teams out of the Europa League, for example, and picking the Champions League, and it makes the other competitions quite lengthy as well. But the Champions League is the big breadwinner for UEFA.
I do think that deal was one that I always like to remember that's happened, because it's still one of these deals that might be nothing, could be something, and that's the Disney Plus deal with them acquiring the UEFA. It was the Conference League and the Europa League rights in Sweden and in Denmark. Now, some people might say that and suggest that it's a real big move by them to come in and make this approach. Disney's sort of position in those markets is a lot more prominent. I think they can probably test and try more things in a hotbed of a market like somewhere like the Nordics. But the fact that they have come along and picked up those rights, and again, we talked about that crossover of audiences. If someone's willing to pay a bit more of a premium for a marketplace where, okay, not often you're going to see the Swedish or Danish teams at the heart of the Champions League, at the very forefront of that, where we can still have a good way of accessing top tier content, even if it's in the second tier, you can probably get that at a fraction of the price of the Champions League rights, which is quite incentivizing for those smaller countries who don't have the scale and the presence that the typical top 5 leagues do.
It's interesting because it's only relatively recently that those rights have been centralized. So with the Europa League, before that was a bit of a wild west out there, where broadcasters would buy individual games depending on what it was, and I think it was only quarterfinals onwards of the UEFA Cup was centralized. So streaming and pay TV, streaming more than pay TV has turned those into their own products in their own right.
Well, speaking of new buyers in terms of getting involved with it, we know that Amazon have been particularly, I suppose, selective about how they choose and where they want to get involved with sports, whether it be in the US, Europe, all around, some of it being seasonal, but they are getting themselves involved with the Champions League. And Steve, you had the opportunity to speak with Alex Green, who will eventually just switch that over to your interview, but maybe just give us a bit of maybe not a sneak peek, but maybe talk a little bit about Amazon, and then perhaps prep everybody for that conversation that you had with Alex after this.
Yeah, so as it has been doing in most of its other major markets, Amazon has become a bigger player in the UK, certainly, but also Germany, directly acquiring rights to sporting competitions. In the UK, it's been the Premier League for, well, that year would have been 2019, so it's been 5 or 6 years as a Premier League partner. That deal is coming to an end because it was a very, very favourable deal. I think it was not a lot of money for 20 live games a season over 2 match days. And it's now gone for the Champions League in the UK. It already shows Champions League in Germany and Italy. And again, it's been attracted by the new format. It's content throughout the year that's going to encourage people to stick around longer with Prime Video, and it sees it as a way to add value to a Prime subscription. And I managed to catch up with Alex at the launch of their Champions League coverage a few weeks ago, and just asked him about how it fits into that wider remit, what they're hoping to do with the rights, how they're going to do things differently, and what it means for consumers. So it's very UK specific, but a lot of the themes are universal, and it's and Alex works across several countries. So yeah, very insightful.
Awesome. Well, Steve, we appreciate you having that on. I also, as a history undergrad, appreciated hearing some of the history behind it, going all the way back to the 50s and all the way through. It's a interesting story and a kind of a nice angle from some of the stuff we normally do. So I appreciate you coming with all the big facts that you brought along today.
Oh, thank you for having me. And I hope everyone's still with us.
Thanks, Steve.
So, Alex, we've just seen your plans for the Champions League in the UK this season, and building it for over the course of the partnership. So, just want to explain what was the thinking behind your approach in terms of the talent you've assembled, the presentation you talked about. What does it mean for you and the company, and what do you want to bring to the market?
Well, it's a big investment for us, and we're super excited about it. It'll be the biggest live sport we've done in the UK so far, and it really takes our offering to the next level in the UK. We've obviously had experience in Germany and Italy from doing a similar package, but this was 2 years ago now when we made the decision to invest in the UK. Seems like a long time ago, but ever since then, we've been, gearing up for this moment. And, given the talent you've seen, given what you've heard about some of the features, and our general approach, I mean, we are super excited and can't wait to get started.
Yeah, I think as viewers and us in the media, we think that build up to a media cycle is too long, whereas for you, it's probably too short trying to get your plans in place. And, it was mentioned during the presentation that when Amazon won the rights to the Premier League, there were staff cheering and then crying. There was, it was such a monumental moment for the company. And it is true that the Premier League is the needle mover in the UK market. And it established you as a premier sports broadcaster in not just the UK, but Europe. Yeah. Do you think the Champions League can do the same for you? And I guess, was the new format an attractive part of that? And do you need the British teams to do well to maximise the impact?
Well, things have moved on since the early days of when we did the first Premier League. I mean, really, as you said, that was the first big moment we'd done a top-tier exclusive sports package in any territory, really, globally. So it was a big step for us and a big test. And, since then, we have grown and we've really, I guess, come of age a bit more as a sports broadcaster. And so now I think that what the Champions League UK will do for us is slightly different, but will still result in enormous awareness, enormous interest, a fabulous additional part of your service for existing Prime members. And as I say, we've seen this work in other territories, in other mature territories like Germany, for example. And we think this will have, if not the same, an even bigger impact.
Now, the deal does see the rights shift from one sole broadcaster to multiple ones. And I know you've talked about making it more accessible. And I do appreciate the point that Prime Video is it's a cheaper price point. It's more accessible from that point. I'm an Amazon subscriber. I'm not paying any extra for it. But do you think it can have the same impact as I grew up with on ITV, for example? Mm-hmm. How do you see it from that point of view, from accessibility and reaching those audiences? I know we live in a very different media market to 20 years ago, but do you think it can have as great an impact on that front?
Yes, I do, and I think that's a decent comparison. I think we are extending the reach. We're widening the audience for Champions League football. As you say, many millions of people across the UK already have Prime. So for them, this is just a wonderful additional property that effectively is free for them. And but there are still people out there who maybe haven't yet been persuaded to take out a Prime membership. Hopefully, this will persuade persuade them to to try it out, and then enjoy all the other amazing content and other benefits like the shipping benefits and music that come with Prime.
I mean, let's talk about the Premier League, because this is your last season as a domestic broadcast partner. You've been very open about it, which is quite unusual for someone who has it was not renewing their contract. It's usually under different circumstances. So, and you said that you hope that it will encourage people who haven't yet subscribed to Prime to sign up. Does that mean you believe that the Champions League can open up a new segment, or is it a shift from acquisition to retention by having those matches throughout the season, or as those two festive blocks? What does that mean for the overall Prime strategy?
Yeah, I mean, it's no one single answer to that. It's pretty much all of the above, to be honest. But as I say, what we have seen in other sort of established territories like Germany, this provides a fantastic reason to still engage with your Prime content and the rest of your Prime membership, and indeed stay as a Prime member. So there's a lot around engagement and retention, but as well, there's always an acquisition potential with these big sports properties, even in very established territories.
And what have you learned from the Premier League? What were you bringing to the Champions League? It's very different competition, but I guess the fundamentals are the same. But what's going to be, what will viewers find familiar? What will they find new?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's been great having the last, it'll be 6 years of Premier League coverage. We've learned a lot about what works for viewers. I actually like to think we've helped push sports broadcasting on in certain respects, particularly things like being pitch side wherever we can, being super close to the action, having managers, having players come up to our desk, both before the match and after the match. I'm really very proud of what we've created there, and it's become much more the norm, actually, for many others as well. So we'll bring a lot of that into our Champions League coverage. As you've seen, a lot of the talent that we've used previously, both in the UK and elsewhere, actually will be part of our coverage. So, yeah, we're definitely building on what we started, really, with the Premier League. We're definitely not starting anew.
And I guess, how's it going to be different broadcasting one game a week as opposed to up to 10 or not? It wasn't quite 10, it was spread over a couple of days, but I guess the technological question for that was making sure everything was reliable and working. But you've showcased a few new tech features, obviously leaning into the wider Amazon organization with particularly when it comes to AI. Can you just explain those and why you chose to prioritize those features over others?
Yeah, we're always really focused on innovations that enhance and help the viewing experience. We never want to do innovations just for innovation's sake, just as a gimmick. They have to be useful, ideally simple, easy to use, and enhance your viewing. So, the couple of things we talked about today, the rapid recap. It's super easy. If you get in late, you're sitting in front of the TV, you want a quick recap, it's one click to get that produced in real time for you. And also our simple sort of navigation bar, if you want to go back to that goal or that penalty, again, making it really easy. And just some people may not want to use them, but those who do, we want them to find it really easily and very simple to use.
Another sort of, I guess, impact of the rights being split in the UK is the fact that not everything will be on one service, and that's obviously that's from a subscription point of view, but also a technological platform. Now, you described a extended partnership with Warner Brothers Discovery, that if you subscribe to Discovery Plus via Amazon's platform, you can seamlessly switch between TNT sports games and your own exclusive games. So what was the logic behind that? How did you go about making that happen? What was the problem you're trying to solve there?
Well, you talk about platforms. In a way, we don't really think about platforms as such, because you can get Prime Video on basically any device as long as it's connected. So, we think more about ease of use and discoverability and selection. And that's where the TNT partnership comes in. It just adds wider selection of Champions League football and other sports as well, and other content at the click of a button for an additional subscription, but very easy to use, all within the same experience on whatever device you happen to be using.
And there's partnerships with DAZN, partnerships with Premier Sports as well, which have the rights to several major competitions.
Yeah.
Is it like an open door for others that want to partner with you on that front and become that aggregator?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, it is. I mean, we've established this channels model. In fact, I was very involved from the start of it in Europe, and it's well established now around the world. And we love being able to offer it. It's a bit similar to the Amazon marketplace in retail. But yes, we welcome all sorts of content partners who can offer customers who have a particular interest in that area, whether it's sports or whether it's movies or what have you. And we can offer that very easily both to the partner as well as to the end viewer.
And just go back to the presentation team, we saw Clarence Seedorf, he's been part of your coverage in Italy. What other benefits are there going to be to having that experience in Germany, Italy? What sort of, I guess, economies of scale? There must be benefits to covering multiple matches across Europe, even though it's one or a limited number in each market.
Yeah, there are. And as I say, we've learned a lot in terms of the logistics, the technology, how you cover one just massive game on its own, which brings a different set of challenges to, for example, our Premier League, where we have lots of concurrent games, perhaps not quite as big for any one of them. And so we'll bring all of that, as well as some of the talent, as you mentioned, Clarence from Italy, Josie from Germany,
course, yes.
and some of our talent from the UK Premier League coverage. And it's brilliant that they're now getting used to working with Amazon. We love to keep that positive energy, that spirit amongst the team, and we think that'll be naturally be brought into our UK Champions League coverage.
Now, the top of the presentation said that, Amazon only ever goes into a business if they feel they can add value. And when that's come to sport, you've tended to go for the biggest rights. You don't need to have everything, but you need to have some of them. And obviously, viewers in the UK will benefit from Amazon's global portfolio with the deals it does elsewhere. Do you feel as though there needs to be another sort of flagship UK right once the Premier League goes? Or do you think that the Champions League is going to deliver the same value to Prime subscribers from a sports perspective?
Yeah, we don't really think about need in that way. We think about what customers will really value and how to find those packages of sports rights that will really kind of resonate with our viewers, and typically that do transcend the day-to-day. So it's less about what do we absolutely need to fill out the service. It's more about what do we like the look of? What do we think our customers will respond to? And then seeing if we're successful, frankly, in bidding for those rights. You can't always bank on ensuring you always keep the same rights, or nothing's guaranteed. But we're very considered in it. We're very targeted. We're very careful. But with this type of package, as with similar packages in other big territories, both in Europe and the US and elsewhere, we really like what they've done for us, and we're super happy if that's if that's our main sports in the UK, for example, for now.
I guess finally, how will you be judging the success of this partnership? Will it be in terms of what the value add subscribers, the number of subscribers you add? For you, what can you define success of what the Champions League coverage in the UK will be?
Well, again, it's a little bit of all of the above, but the most important thing to start off, and I said this way back when we did our first Premier League coverage, the most important thing by far is to do it well from the start. If we do it well, that'll build its own momentum, its own buzz, its own awareness, and I'm sure that all the numbers will follow. But our main focus now is let's kick off this new amazing package of rights. Let's kick it off in a really good way and get people talking about it and enjoying the coverage.
Alex, thank you very much for your time, and we look forward to Matchday 1.
Thanks very much.
Now, before you go, if you liked what you heard today, be sure to rate and review and just let me know what you think on social. You can find me on most social platforms as SportsProNick. And please do spread the word of the podcast. There's no better way of marketing than word of mouth, whether that be in person or on social media. And if you don't like what you've heard, or you think we should be doing more or less of something, then reach out and let me know, as I'd love to hear from you. Thanks, Dreamtimers. Until next time.